Okay. Good afternoon. Thanks for coming. I'm Jim Pethokoukis of the American Enterprise Institute. I'd like to welcome everyone to our discussion of the new book in my hand, The Wealth of Religions by AEI visiting scholars Rachel McCleary Lee and Robert Barro, also both of Harvard University. We'll be joined after their presentation in an exploration of the book's themes by Robert George of Princeton University and Phillip Phan of Johns Hopkins. The book title reflects a conscious choice to recall Adam Smith's most lasting work, The Wealth of Nations. Robert and Rachel's book performs a mighty task of broadly applying Smith's foundational thinking to religion. The Wealth of Religion deals with questions of political economy and religious faith at both the macro and micro levels. On the macro side, many questions. Does high religious belief enhance or stifle a country's economic growth? If a country institutes a state-sponsored religion, does this depress religious believers or excite them? What matters more for economic outcomes? That a given population attends church a lot, or they actually believe their religious doctrine wholeheartedly? For the micro questions, what specific beliefs affect economics? Do some religions seem to get it right on the economy while others get it wrong? And how do religions themselves use economics, say, in the case of Catholics and Protestants, when they seem to be competing over a similar pool of believers? Rachel and Robert argue that these questions still remain novel to the field of economics because religion is a unique phenomenon. Religion can be a driver of personal motivation like no other force in the world, and what discipline is better suited to study motives, incentives, and deterrents than economics? These two have not been deterred from asking profound, if unorthodox, questions about religion's relationship with the global economy, and luckily for all of us, they put in the work so we can have good answers to many of these questions. And before we get to the panel discussion, Robert and Rachel each going to have, I think, a brief presentation. I think Rachel's going to be first. Fantastic.
Well, thank you. Robert and I began this work together in 2003, and we began in the field of the political economy of religion. We were interested in questions about how belief influences economic behavior and productivity. The field at the time had been dominated by sociologists who were interested in organizational aspects of religion. And it actually began by looking at these extreme cults that had moved into California and why were young people joining these cults. Well, Robert and I were really more interested in the Weberian line of argument. We wanted to know how it is that people work hard, they foster trust, they engage in thrift and productivity. Those questions to us seem the more salient ones in terms of what religion imparts from generation to generation. So I'm just going to give you a brief overview of the intellectual history that brought us to this book. Now, as I mentioned, we began with the writings of Max Weber. The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism was basically our motivator. But the sociologists and economists basically said this can't be proven. So we started here, and I'm going to start with Martin Luther and basically give you the intellectual thread. It's going to be very brief. Martin Luther basically delinked two things. He delinked salvation from monastic asceticism, and he basically said that with the priesthood of all believers, we can all gain salvation. Furthermore, through baptism, we can all interpret the Bible. And finally, as apostles and elders in the Christian church, we could convene councils. So he leveled the playing field. And he made the argument that good works, that the special salvific merit that one earns by belonging to a monastic community or being a pope or archbishop or bishop, was no longer true. And in fact, what happens is that the work ethic is the salvific merit that you earn by belonging to an order is now part of ordinary work. And he referred to this as the calling. Our calling is to work day in and day out at our work for the glory of God. Through faith, we perform our ordinary functions, our ordinary vocation. And this is what gives us joy. So what Martin Luther introduces into this psychology, which I will end up with Max Weber, is the psychology of enjoying the labor that you engage in and day out. But but Martin Luther didn't change a lot of things. He didn't change the medieval structure per se. So he argued that the vocation that you were born into is the one that you should accept, and you should not rebel against it. Martin Luther did not introduce a profit-seeking motive here, rational profit-seeking, nor did he introduce a concept of rational organization of labor. So John Calvin, who has a more complete theology, argued that since the fall of Adam and Eve from the garden, the relationship between human beings and God is one where our function as human beings is to work day in and day out. And he didn't have a pretty picture of this work. This was drudgery, it was arduous, it was full of all kinds and varieties of evil, as he describes it. But out of this, God in exchange, you may think that this is hopelessness, but God in exchange says, but you have my creation. And if you work hard day in and day out, and you're disciplined, and you produce out of my creation what I have given you, then you are welcome to the wealth that you produce with your labor. So what John Calvin does introduce is the profit-seeking motive. And he says that if you are prosperous, if you are economically prosperous through your labor, this is success. And this success is a testimony of divine action in the world. So what John Calvin does is he makes a step further. He introduced rational profit making, but he also delinks asceticism from daily labor, which Martin Luther had not done. So now, if you're prosperous, you should enjoy your wealth. You should be happy that you have it. And you shouldn't claim that you have to live these very frugal lifestyles, which is something that Martin Luther had yet to give up. So John Calvin introduces what Max Weber calls the spirit of capitalism. Okay, so Max Weber, the motive that John Calvin imputes to our working hard is that we want to live in the glory of God. This is our relationship with God. Max Weber comes along and he stresses salvation anxiety. So he focuses on John Calvin's doctrine of predestination. And he argues that since none of us know we're going to be saved, you could be fatalistic and just give up and not work. You could just say, oh, what the hell? I don't know if I'm going to be saved, so I can just go out and do what I want. But in fact, Calvin doesn't say that, and Max Weber doesn't either. Max Weber says what happens is you become anxious. Am I going to be saved or not? And how do I? How do I become saved? Well, you work really hard. You work hard day in and day out at what God has given you. And if you happen to become wealthy and prosperous, then you can interpret that as a sign of God's grace. But Max Weber was focusing on the Puritans, and unlike John Calvin, who argued that there's a community in which you engage in this prosperity and you share it, Max Weber was focusing on the Puritans, and he focuses on the isolation and the loneliness of seeking your own salvation. So this is the intellectual line in which we're working. Now, Robert and I have been looking at the relationship between what is called believing and belonging. And we do argue that beliefs in heaven and hell, what we call otherworldly compensators, are important to your hard work, your economic productivity. But we find that the input into religion, if you put too much into a religion, if you look at Tibetan Buddhism, for example, I'm sure you can come up with examples of your own. If too many resources are going into the religion, then that detracts from your productivity. It also detracts from the output, the beliefs that you learn and that are acquired through attending a religion and your faith. So we believe that there's a balance between believing and belonging that contributes to economic activity and prosperity. And we also notice that in Islam, and that's my last point, in Islam, there are high beliefs relative to religious participation. But we also make the note that why aren't Islamic countries extremely wealthy? Well, part of the problem is that the religion has injunctions on certain types of economic activity. for example, credit and their inheritance laws that limit the ability to gain wealth and accumulate wealth. And we believe that these have a deterrent effect on economic growth. Just some ideas.
Okay, I just wanted to say a few words about some current research related to religion and economy that Rachel and I are engaged in. This relates to the work that's discussed toward the end of our book about the role of saint-making in the Catholic Church. And we think that saint-making has increasingly been used as kind of a strategic device, particularly to compete against alternative religions, of which what's most pertinent these days is evangelical Protestantism, and particularly in regions such as in Latin America and Africa, which is particularly important. So we have some new work we're currently engaged in extending this kind of research. First point is that in terms of numbers of saints chosen, which is done in a two-stage process of a beatification and canonization, John Paul II is a tremendous outlier. He actually beatified as many persons as all the popes before him, going back to 1585, which is the first year in which we've put together data that we've examined in terms of the saint-making process. Some people look at this as a kind of cheapening of the currency, that it sort of doesn't mean as much as it used to, but Rachel and I actually think it's a quite clever strategic device that makes people more enthusiastic about the church and perhaps tends to ward off conversions into especially evangelicalism. So these are just some numbers related to the recent popes and putting that in the context of the broader history. This expresses the numbers of persons beatified per year in office, taking account of the tenure of the Pope. So John Paul II, you can see at 12 per year, is dramatically higher than the predecessor popes. For example, the 37 popes up to 1978 is less than 1 per year. And this was dramatically stepped up under John Paul II. Benedict XVI basically maintained a similar pace of beatification. And Francis has roughly maintained the same pace during his tenure thus far. Further down on the table, you can see the second stage of saint-making, canonization, when you actually become an official confessor-type saint. It looks like the numbers went up if you look from John Paul II to Benedict to Francis. Actually, that's misleading. What happened is that John Paul II named so many people in the first stage that there was a tremendous stock of candidates for what you might consider promotion in the second stage when you're named a saint and you're canonized, sort of like the distinction between assistant professors and full professors. So we estimated that actually Benedict XVI and Francis were basically canonizing so many people because of the big number of candidates that had been provided by John Paul II. And they didn't actually step up the pace of naming saints relative to what he had done. We also document an important competition kind of response. We show that the numbers of persons chosen and also the locations reacted particularly to competition from evangelicals. So we document that empirically, especially looking in the 20th century, where we were able to isolate that kind of effect. So this work is part of what's in our book, toward the end of the book. So one of the things we're looking at more recently is the process of choosing martyrs rather than regular saints, which are known as confessors. Of course, a big difference is that to be martyred, you have to be killed in connection with hatred of the church. It's a different kind of credential, if you will, that you need in order to be named. It's also true that martyrs are typically chosen in groups, which sometimes can extend to hundreds of people. We've been looking at martyrs chosen, so with considerable effort, we've collected the data now back to, again, the beginning of our sample, which is 1585, and we know how many are chosen under each pope until the recent ones. The interesting pattern in recent decades is the remarkable acceleration of martyrs being chosen under Francis. This was not a process that was dramatically accelerated by John Paul II, although he did choose more than his predecessors. It's Francis that really thinks that martyrdom is something very special in terms of inspiring the faithful, and that shows up in the numbers. It's also true that if you look at martyrs chosen, it follows the kind of competition response that we found for the regular or confessor saints. That there's this pattern, particularly of competing with evangelicals, and it plays a particularly prominent role in Latin America, which is the continent that has the most Catholics in the world, actually. So there are two things that we're working on currently. We found these responses of choosing confessor saints and martyrs in response to things that we viewed as competition, and we interpreted that as an effort by the church to compete more effectively. But what we haven't done in our research is to document whether this has worked or not. We really haven't proven that by doing this, it made people more enthusiastic, it reduced conversions out of Catholicism, had other kinds of effects. That's the thing we're working on currently. And the first stage of that research is we're trying to assemble information on baptisms by diocese in the Catholic Church. We're starting with the recent data, but then we're trying to go back to cover the history, at least to 1900, and we hope we can go back much further as we have with the other data. So we're trying to see, by looking at baptisms as a measure of the response of the Catholic faithful, whether there actually is some indication that naming of saints has some impact on that kind of behavior. So for example, in Guatemala, all of a sudden there's a lot of saints being named, particularly martyrs, and we're trying to see, is there a response to that in terms of what the typical Catholics are actually doing? So that's the current project we're working on. Whether it'll be successful or not, at this point, I really can't say, but that's what we're currently in the middle of. Okay.
Outstanding. Well, the panelists have promised me a free-flowing, dynamic, no-holds-barred conversation. People's feelings will be neglected. We're just going to tell the truth up here. I'm going to, but please again, feel free to jump in. Questions don't necessarily, wait for me to ask a question. I'm sure your questions are better than any questions I'm going to have. But that will not stop me from asking a question. Aligned politicians love this pops up in speeches, is that it's often credited to Alexis de Tocqueville, who apparently did not say it, but has not stopped anybody from using it. It's America is great because America is good. And if America ever ceases to be good, America will cease to be great. And I thought of that line as I was reading the book, and I thought of it in this way. One conclusion one would at least draw from maybe a superficial reading the book is that America's wealth and economic prosperity is linked to our religiosity, or at least our fear that we're not so religious and maybe we're all going to hell. So does that actually play a role in, do you think, in America's economic success, our level of religiosity?
I think it's consistent with the evidence we had that the diversity of religions available in the U.S., which Tocqueville particularly remarked on, had something to do with the vibrancy of the religion market and with the implicitly the level of religiosity. We found some linkage from, as Rachel mentioned, religious beliefs to economic results. We didn't really find that going to church more often was particularly strongly related to economic outcomes. So to the extent that it was beliefs that were promoted, that would fit in with our analysis in terms of crediting now with some particular economic response.
I mean, Rachel's first point is, to many people that's kind of the stunner. It's all the research is fascinating, but that it's not church attendance, and I don't know. Therefore, you go to church, so you're more necessarily a more responsible. But it's that belief in heaven and hell. Maybe you could just flesh out a little bit, at least about what you think that mechanism is like.
Well, the belief in heaven and hell is clearly belief in hell comes out as slightly stronger than belief in heaven. But I think the fear, particularly in Protestantism, it's an either-or proposition. So you would want to be motivated to move in one direction as opposed to the other. And in that sense, it's a very strong motivator. So what we call otherworldly compensators are also tied to this worldly rewards, like if you're honest, if you're trustworthy, if you're thrifty, if you're disciplined, well, then there's a reward for that. And that reward is that you will attain salvation. That's the link that we make. Now, theologians say that John Calvin and Martin Luther, in Protestantism, we've never really said that those types of things are linked. But that's simply not true. If you look at Jonathan Edwards and some of the early theologians and Puritan theologians, they do make that link. That if you behave in a certain way in this world, you will get that otherworldly reward, that otherworldly thing. So yeah, they do motivate people in that way.
And just by happenstance, the moderator of this panel was brought up in the Dutch Calvinist Christian Reformed Church, so very, very lovely seeing John Calvin up there. It's been a while. It doesn't really pop up that much at AEI. But just because we're in America, just to focus for a second, that sort of, what sort of drive that sort of diversity of religion, and what is sort of, do you think, the impact on economic growth? You mentioned we don't have a state church. We don't. We have a flourishing diversity of religion. So then, how does that impact economic growth?
Well, part of the way that impacts economic growth is that if you have a separation of church and state, that people choose their religion, that they're involved in selecting the type of way that they wish to worship, that they seek to worship, and the beliefs that they want to hold. So in a market that is pluralistic, people choose it. It's a choice that they make in how they want to practice their religion. And so that does raise, as Adam Smith said, what it does is it introduces into the general civic environment moderation and tolerance, because people have to work out their differences. And if you can't believe in something and then, the monopolistic tendencies are regulated by the market, is what he says. And so that leads to people exchanging ideas and becoming familiar with other people and other people's ideas. Adam Smith argues that in The Wealth of Nations. So in that sense, I would say that if you have conditions of tolerance and moderation, then people can engage in economic activities far better than if you're constantly in conflict and strife.
Church attendance in the United States is down. So what about the more sort of important finding about belief in heaven and hell? Has that moved in lockstep with declining church attendance?
For rich countries, the U.S. is down somewhat on those metrics, but it's still strikingly high in comparison with other rich countries, particularly in Western Europe. That feeds into this general question about secularization and whether it's regularly true that when you get more economically developed, maybe better educated, more urban, do you tend to become less religious? I think there is an overall pattern where general economic development is negatively related to various dimensions of religiosity. But the U.S. is quite unusual in that respect. And the diversity of offerings, the nature of the market, I think is partly responsible for that. I mean, Ireland is another case of a fairly rich country that's surprisingly religious, although recently those numbers have also come down somewhat. Poland is another country that's fairly well off economically, but still surprisingly religious, although not as much quite as 20 years ago. But those are kind of the outlier countries among the richer ones.
So I was going to say that, in fact, it might be worthwhile separating sort of the practice of religion from belief and values. And, in my own work, I'm very interested in entrepreneurship, innovation, what makes economies grow over time. I think fundamentally is an entrepreneurial tendency in them or not. I don't know if we could show the slide.
Yeah, here.
Oh, it's over here, yeah. So this is adapted from Jankov and his colleagues at Harvard. And here, what he's trying to show, what they are trying to show is sort of the relationship between sort of institutional environments and sort of, the productivity of an economy. And in this, it's a graphic in the Journal of Comparative Economics. What they're basically arguing is that when you have institutional arrangements that are either state-controlled, what we call the China model, or completely privatized. So you end up in situations where you either have sort of rent-seeking by the state or state larceny or individual larceny, right? But in those societies where you see sort of positive, wealth-creating entrepreneurship that's healthy and sustainable over time, you end up with institutional arrangements that are based on two things. One, you have legal systems that are well-defined, that are transparent, that are easy to understand, and then you have enforcement. That's sort of their argument, and they sort of stop there. I'm interested to know, well, in those economies where you see healthy entrepreneurship, and you don't see individuals or institutions or organizations exploiting the opportunities, to the extent that it hurts, other stakeholders. What drives that, right? So, basic to every, I think, entrepreneurial economy is the private contract. You can't have innovation, you can't have discovery, you can't take these risks unless you enter into private contracts with another individual. What keeps these private contracts stable and sustainable over time, I would argue, is the Judeo-Christian ethic. I believe it's faith. Now, it's also very interesting when you look at those economies that are more or less Judeo-Christian, you could sort of sort them out by whether the entrepreneurial economy tends towards stability and sustained wealth creation, or they end up either becoming sort of larcenous, like Russia or Russia-type situations, or sort of more state-controlled, rent-seeking, like in China. So this is. So I've been thinking a lot about this, and it seems to me that the book is sort of a perfect jumping off point to this question, which is, are there in fact, and I particularly like the second half of the book, which talks about sort of the comparisons between different faith traditions and what this results in terms of economic growth. And I think fundamental to that is, what does this result in terms of entrepreneurial activity or innovation or risk-taking, without the assurance of return, that continues to exist and not break down because either the state takes over or individuals begin to exploit each other's weaknesses.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd like to say a word about that because I think so much of it is right on the mark, but I have a question about it. I'm wondering if the fundamental factor there is faith or rather is trust, social trust.
Sure.
And it could be that in the Judeo-Christian societies and perhaps elsewhere, faith is a source of trust, but it's the trust doing the work. And here I'm thinking of Japan, situation where you don't have a Judeo-Christian history or ethic, but you've got a high level of trust that seems to underwrite the functioning of the contractual system. So I'm inclined to think that it is trust and that there might be different sources of trust. The other thing I think we need to undergird trust as something that's a function of belief is functioning judicial enforcement of contracts, reliable. In so many places where we've been unable to establish working market economies to the benefit of the people. It's been corruption of the judicial system, the unpredictability of outcomes. People can't rely on courts to actually enforce obligations when people get into a dispute, which might be a good faith dispute between two people who are perfectly honest themselves, but just read their understanding differently.
So that's a really good point. So on the question of Japan, that's a very interesting, I think, natural experiment, because in fact, Japan has a very well-functioning, market economy. But in fact, one of the problems has been that entrepreneurialism, now part of it is structure, right? It's an economy dominated by sort of large companies that came out of these networks called the Geretsu. But you don't see a great deal of sort of innovation at the individual level, right? In terms of startups, if you just look at the share of startups relative to the economy, Japan ranks pretty low. So here you have a high trust, mostly because of cultural homogeneity, but not necessarily sort of faith-based. But it's an N of one, so it's hard to sort of test that. The other question that you have, I think is really interesting, and I think could be the basis of a research topic, which is in those economies that don't have strong legal enforcement, institutions of legal enforcement, and yet have maybe strong faith traditions, do we still see entrepreneurial activity? That's interesting. I don't know. I don't know if that's true. I don't know if an economy like that actually exists, or you can identify that.
In terms of economic growth, there's a lot of evidence that something that looks like maintenance of rule of law is particularly important as a positive element there. That doesn't really say where is it that the rule of law came from, and is there a religion element somehow bolstering that? It doesn't really isolate that. The kinds of trust measures that people have used, or social interactions, I think it's harder really to demonstrate a systematic relation of those to economic growth, although you might think it would be important. In terms of our work, I mean, we've looked at economic development in an overall sense, broken out things like education, urbanization, life expectancy. But I think it's difficult to particularly separate out the role of entrepreneurship, which I know is your focus. So we haven't really been able to break that out as a separate element. Maybe it's feasible to do that, but we haven't done that.
Let me ask my economics colleagues, if I'm right about this, that it seems to me that among the central things you need to have a flourishing economic life, a flourishing economy, are people whose lives are orderly, but also at least some people who are capable of quite a great deal of creativity. So you need orderly lives and you need creativity. Religion, belief and practice, among other things, tends to enable people to live orderly lives. But you also do need creativity, which I think requires that people be challenged in their beliefs, that there be a kind of marketplace of ideas, and the kind of freedom that enables that to happen. And I imagine where you don't have that, and whether the cause is an established religion or an oppressive theocratic sort of regime or anything else, I'd imagine where you don't have that, you're just not going to get the dynamism that we associate with the best functioning market economies. I can think of an analogy, and it's the contemporary academy. It's a place where we have an established religion. That religion is secular progressivism. That's the established religion. And where I live, and I suspect where you live, and order is enforced by the established church. But what we lack, I think precisely because we've got an established church that is pretty strict about enforcing norms, is a lack of creativity. You don't have people challenging each other. So the thing we're supposed to be putting out, ideas, insights, knowledge, we're supposed to be truth-seeking institutions. The truth-seeking process gets impeded, gets blocked so often because orthodoxies are formally or informally enforced. The established religion does not allow for the kind of marketplace that Tocqueville noticed we have in the social field when it comes to actual religions in the ordinary sense.
I think Timur Karan's research on Muslim societies particularly touches on what you were discussing, because he looks at particularly legal regulatory restrictions, which he thinks have had a negative impact in terms of investment, entrepreneurship. He particularly talks about the structure of corporate law, and he talks about insurance and credit markets, and about restrictions related to inheritance that can inhibit the kind of accumulation of large stocks of wealth. So implicitly, at least in his work, he's saying that something about the legal regulatory framework driven by religious precepts is inhibiting implicitly something about entrepreneurship and innovativeness and hence economic growth. I think that's Timur's story about Muslim societies.
You know, I would also say that actually one of the reasons why in economies that perhaps, and I go back to sort of the Judeo-Christian concept or tradition of promise keeping, right, is that if individuals trust, but they trust on the basis of a set of values as opposed to quid pro quo, you actually end up in a situation where the institutional dead weight, if you will, of legal rules and enforcement is much lower, right? So you could have an economy in which you have very strong rules and regulation and extremely heavy-handed enforcement of these rules that cause people to behave, but then you end up in, I think in an economy in which the costs of doing that sort of would outweigh, any benefits you get from private transaction. So I think that's and I think that's sort of this idea that you have sort of these two institutional extremes, and the sweet spot is where you have rules that are transparent, enforced fairly, but individuals entering into private transactions because of trust, but the foundation of trust being a faith tradition that says, I say I'm going to do this, and therefore I'm going to do it. It's like the James 2:17 verse, right? That says, show me somebody who says they've got faith. I'll show you somebody who demonstrates his faith by its works. Meaning, I behave according to what I believe to be true, as opposed to I'm being forced to do it. Yeah.
Well, another element in this is that John Calvin, unlike Martin Luther, and I think this in John Wesley and in the other, as you look on down, the Protestant theologians, even though they were of a different type, was the idea that each person has talent. So John Calvin in Geneva was very clear that you're born into a vocation, and what gives you your stability is not the social order, as Martin Luther argued, the medieval social order, but what gives you stability is that you're working day in and day out. You're disciplined, you're working at something, but then he said, well, you may find that you're better at something else, and that opportunity is in another city, and he said, go for it. He was definitely, because he was living in a city that was experiencing international trade.
True.
And there was a lot of textile industry. And the other thing that's interesting about John Calvin is that he didn't believe in charity, not in the sense that you give handouts and alms, because every person is a child of God, and every person has the
Potential.
Well, yeah, if you want to be in a relationship with God, you have to work. There is no other function for you but to work hard day in and day out at this drudgery. And so his whole idea is we don't give alms to the poor. There's no free riding here. So that's he was a good economist in a sense. He understood how to make that city work. And so I think when I look at John Wesley, work all you can, save all you can, and the give all you can is kind of out of line there. But John Wesley, he influenced Methodism, just influenced the world. But his first premise was work hard. Work hard at what you do and save. And that frugality of using your talents, but don't give up. And a lot of people say that he saved England from a violent revolution because of this.
Christian thinkers throughout history, and I'm sure this will be true as long as there are Christian thinkers, and not just Christian thinkers, but ordinary Christians have had to wrestle with this teaching of Jesus that no man can serve two masters. He will either love one and hate the other, or respect one and disdain the other. No man can serve both God and money. No man can serve both God and mammon. And figuring out what he meant by that and how that works is a challenge. When I first saw the book, The Wealth of Religion's great book, by the way. When I first saw the book, of course, it recalls, as Jim pointed out, the title of Adam Smith's great work, The Wealth of Nations, which Rachel and Robert, in their early part of the book, identify as the book held by many to be the founding text of modern economics. The first thought that came into my mind was, well, this is God and money, and what do they have to do? Economists are concerned with money, right? Religion is concerned with God. But then it dawned on me that economics and religion go back a long way together. And even that book from which the title was gotten, The Wealth of Nations, where did that phrase come from? Of course, the full title was Adam Smith's An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. But of course, for Christians and Jews, that immediately recalls that Isaiah tells us that when the Messiah comes, the wealth of nations shall be poured out before him. And in the Christian telling of the story, of course, this is fulfilled when the wise men from the east come bearing the gifts of incense, frankincense, gold, and myrrh. So even Smith, in titling his book, is capturing those resonances from the Bible.
I didn't know that. I didn't know that's where you got it. Yeah, that's interesting.
Most of my economist friends don't know that.
So in the Bible, does the wealth come from hard work and innovation, or it just comes from outside and you have the wealth?
Which Christian theologian are we?
Who would you like to interpret that for you?
Well, it ultimately comes from God, right?
Yes.
Yes, that's right.
So the argument is that God has given us the talents, right? Given us the opportunity, and then it is our responsibility to use that. It goes back to Eden, right? It goes back to the garden,
fall,
essentially.
yeah.
Right?
Now, in my own wing of the Christian tradition, in the Catholic faith, there's the teaching of the popes as part of what's called Catholic social teaching, of the universal destination of the world's goods. So the world's goods don't come attached to any particular individual. They belong to everybody. But then there's a question about, well, okay, how do we distribute them? What do we do with them? Because the church also defends the idea of private property, not as just a mere prudential matter, but as an actual right. If you look at the papal social teaching from Leo XIII forward, there's a right to private property. There's a condemnation of the social ownership of property in any kind of comprehensive way, what you economists, I think, would call the command economy, or the idea of socialism, strictly speaking. Actually, if you want to hear some condemnations of socialism, now capitalism comes in for a beating too, but you want to hear some really good condemnations, of strong condemnation of socialism, go to that tradition of papal social teaching going all the way back to Leo XIII. But the way the circle squared between the universal destination of all goods and private property is that if the goods of the world, which come from God, and God intends for the use of mankind, are to be taken advantage of for the sake of human beings, as many of us as possible, as fully as possible, they need to be distributed, they need to be privately owned, they need to be exploited, not in the negative sense of exploited, taken advantage, they have to be developed, worked, and there are various things that need to be taken out. There's not taken into account. There's not one master principle for distribution. Desert matters. Hard work matters. Risk-taking matters in the understanding of distributive justice. But need also matters.
Right.
You know?
Right.
That there has been a disaster and people are in need also matters. There's not just one principle. There are a set of principles. And within that set, here, prudential judgment is required on the part of policy makers and people who advise policy makers and think about these things as to how we can best take advantage of the world's resources to do as much good for human beings as possible.
It sounds like a market economy with some kind of provision of a basic social safety net.
Exactly right.
Is what I think
Right.
you were saying.
Exactly right. And with the additional feature would be a concern to protect the autonomy and integrity of crucial institutions of civil society that are between the state and the individual, the institutions that have the primary role of providing health, education, and welfare for people, and transmitting to each new generation of people the virtues, the habits, the traits that are necessary to lead successful lives and be good citizens and contributors to the flourishing of the economy, among other social institutions.
I mean, there's been a lot of talk about some of these left behind areas in the United States and sort of declining religiosity, declining church attendance, breakdown of civil society. Do we need to have not religious attendance, but a deep, abiding belief in heaven and hell for there to be a successful civil society?
I wonder if you need something like that, and I wouldn't want to instrumentalize these things, but since you asked the question.
Or at least hell.
In order, yeah. You need, it looks to me like you need belief if you want people. If you don't want a demographic collapse. There needs to be meaning. People need to think there's more than just having a decent job, a decent life, a BMW, 4 weeks vacation, kind of what sometimes referred to as the European model. That this is what a worthy life, and a dog, because it's really not worth having kids. They're a lot of trouble, and what's it all mean anyway? And we got Social Security, and we've got our 401ks, and to take care of us in old age, and there's special arrangements.
Right, this is Old Town Alexandria, is basically.
Yeah, Old Town Alexandria. Yeah, but I think the real challenge for secularism is having kids, being motivated to have kids. You look at Israel, divided between secular and religious people, and sometimes quite bitterly divided. The religious communities in Israel are having lots of kids. Secular Jews, in Israel. I'm talking about the Jewish community, not the Palestinian community in Israel, but among the Jewish community, secular members of that community having a lot fewer kids. I think we are below replacement now in the United States, and it wouldn't shock me if there's some kind of correlation with, and I agree with Robert, it's modest, the modest decline of religious belief here. But you've had a much steeper decline over the past several decades in Europe, and they're in a demographic freefall.
But economically, Scandinavia seems to be doing pretty well without a lot of religiosity. How does we mentioned Japan as kind of maybe an outlier. How does Scandinavia work into your research?
Yeah.
Scandinavia is actually a case where belief is high relative to belonging, because nobody goes to church, basically. And it's a monopolized Lutheran religion sector, and nobody goes. Beliefs are not nearly as low as the attendance. So
belief in heaven and hell?
Well,
what is the belief?
Yeah, including that,
Yeah.
yes, and belief in an afterlife. Scandinavian country actually fits our model pretty well. We don't have to strain too much. But it's clear that if you look around the world, you can find examples of strong economic growth over a sustained period without a religious foundation. China is a prominent example of that over the last 40 years. And there's a lot of discussion about, what is a substitute kind of framework that motivates people without that basis? And if you go back longer, of course, you can think about the role of Confucianism as usually not thought of as a religion, but as some kind of philosophical background, and what function does that serve in China over the longer term? But I wouldn't say that you have to have a religious foundation to do well in terms of economic growth. I think there are kind of substitute mechanisms that seem like they sometimes work.
Well, it seems to me that when we think, for example, in terms of innovation, if you compare China to the United States, if you're thinking about other types of activities, I think when we look at the United States, we have to realize that, it's been a while since we were founded on these religious beliefs, and so we have in place institutions that are respected and are supported and are appealed to. We tend to rely on them, second nature, and that type of thing. What we are seeing in the United States is the rise of the nuns, N-O-N-E-S. So millennials starting around 1900, we've been seeing a steady decline in religious participation and somewhat in religious beliefs. But this is generational succession that we're seeing, and so particularly starting with the baby boomers, who did not raise their children in a particular faith. So what you saw was with the great generation before the baby boomers, those who weren't born into a religion, when they became adults, they would go back. They would enter religion. But we're finding that this pattern isn't holding anymore. So for example, millennials and Generation Z now, we're finding that there are higher levels of non-believers in this nuns category. And so they hold very general, when they're surveyed, they hold very general beliefs like, do you believe in God? Do you believe in an afterlife? Do you believe that all religions hold some truth? And of course, there's a high response to those because they're vacuous. Those are vacuous types of questions that are being asked on the surveys. These younger people are not going to church. They are not going to a formal religion. And a lot of them increasingly are not being raised in a religious tradition. So the question that's being raised is, are we seeing a secularization, or are we seeing simply a mutation in religion itself? I mean, because we all seem to function on this notion that human beings need spirituality. They need something, be it a New Age religion or some form of belief. But that seems to be the trend in the United States. Now the question, and we haven't studied this, but this would be interesting, is how do you correlate that with the activity that we saw coming out of the first Americans, that they were highly religious, they were highly motivated, highly individualistic, belief in heaven and hell, salvation and damnation played a big role in their lives. Okay, so younger people don't have that. Are they equally motivated? Max Weber's response would be, no, they're not motivated by that.
They seem very motivated in Silicon Valley, and there's a lot of nuns.
Right, but Max Weber would say what's happened is, and this is the whole point of his book, is that those religious, that religious structure has been knocked down, and now they're totally motivated by what John Calvin would call appetites. They're motivated by greed. They're motivated by money. And it has nothing to do with spirituality. It has nothing to do with how this whole long history began. That's...
Oh, it's something.
Yeah, isn't it? But that's right. Then we have to think about where we are now. Yeah.
I mean, Weber didn't think that the Protestant ethic story was still important at the time when he was writing in the late 19th century, for example. And in that respect, Rachel and I are more Weberian than Weber was, because we tried to apply this thesis, but in the context of more modern data, where I think he would have said this shouldn't work.
To reinforce something that Rachel said a moment ago, I saw some polling data the other day that showed an increase in belief in ghosts and witches and occult matters.
Yeah.
People seem to want to believe in something, and when traditional religion disappears, it's not as if people necessarily believe in nothing or nothing supernatural or nothing spiritual. Other things come in
they find a substitute
to fill the space.
Perhaps the Avengers. That might be.
So with regard to what you said earlier about trust, I have a little bit of evidence. I don't know, you can tell me whether it's of use. There's a recent study that looked at Catholic abuse scandals and when they were revealed in the media, and then looked at what was the response to these revelations in the media in different locations and different points in time. So the basic finding was that in response to these revelations that Catholic church attendance went down, and some related religious beliefs also declined. What didn't, there was also a big negative effect on donations to the Catholic Church.
Yes, I was going to point that out. Yeah, that's what I noticed.
And this paper argues that the dollars involved there are much bigger than what the church is directly having to pay out in terms of legal judgments. But what the study did not find was effects on these other possibly related variables. They found no effect on trust. They found no effect on other kinds of social organization participation. So they didn't find these kinds of spillovers from religion to these other things that you were thinking about.
Yeah.
But of course, this is just one study, but I think it's an interesting one.
There's a lot of interesting stuff going on in the Catholic Church, and it's not just Catholics, I think, would find it interesting. Lots of people who aren't Catholics would find it interesting. One of the things that's happening is we have our own rise of the nuns, but this is the NUN nuns. But it's the rise of the nuns in the more conservative, mainly newer, younger religious orders. The old line orders, the old traditional orders, the ones you've probably heard of, whether you're Catholic or not, the vocations to those traditions seem to be going way down, really falling off a cliff. But those are the orders that have gone more liberal, more progressive, whose ideologies are more in line with secular progressivism of the sort we find in universities and so forth. The more traditional ones, the newer, Mother Teresa's order, very orthodox, very traditional order. They've got a lot of vocations. New orders that have been founded on much more traditional Catholic principles. Plenty of young women want to sign up for the life that's on offer there. So it's a different rise of the nuns.
That's interesting. Yeah, I had heard that young women were moving into religious orders because they were confused about the dating scene. That was part of the explanation. I don't know how true this is,
it
but
would be good.
Very
You economists,
is,
I think, could do us a big favor here. I mean, there's been this really interesting work on the marriage market and the mating market. You might know Mark Regnerus's book, Cheap Sex, which got a lot of attention just a year or so ago. And I think that's valuable work. But we are now in a situation, as I understand it, and I'm not an economist or a social scientist, but as I understand it, we're now in a situation where the marriage market for women is tougher, fewer marriageable men available. Will that have the effect for Catholic girls who are in that situation in some numbers of increasing the attractiveness of religious life, what we call religious life, the orders of sisters, if they can make themselves attractive, as apparently some of the more conservative orders are making themselves attractive to these young women?
But do you see these so within the United States, the conservative Christians have held their percentage of the U.S. population fairly steadily over a few generations. So the question then becomes, given how stable conservative Christians are in the U.S. population, do you see this as a response to that in terms of the Catholics moving more towards a conservative order?
I don't know the answer to the question, and I suspect that it is.
Might be.
It is complex. Across the board, Catholic and non-Catholic, the nuns seem to be not people who have decided to become atheists, but rather those who were weakly affiliated with Protestant, Catholic, or Jewish mainly faiths, and now no longer tell the pollsters, I'm Jewish, or I'm Catholic, or I'm Unitarian, or Church of Christ, or what have you. So it's not clear that belief has changed. That was my point. It goes back to something Robert said. It's not clear that belief has changed, or necessarily that attendance is going to vary here. It's just, do I think of myself as a Methodist, Baptist, Catholic, Jewish, whatever?
So the evangelical faiths look quite different in this regard. I mean, that's where there's the most vibrancy, growth in the U.S., but not just in the U.S. It's particularly important in Latin America, Africa,
Asia.
Yeah,
in fact, conservatism among the evangelicals, the conservative branch is actually seeing huge growth, has been for some time in places like Asia, which is sort of very interesting to test to see if, in fact, that also correlates with the increase in, risk-taking entrepreneurship, economic development.
A lot of Catholics, including Catholic leaders, see the future of the Catholic churches in Asia and particularly in Africa. And I know from my Pentecostal friends that Pentecostalism is just booming in Africa.
Right.
And there, of course, there's a lot of competition between the Christians and the Muslims.
Correct.
South Korea has particularly
Yes.
strong growth in terms of evangelicals. I was there once. I bought this Buddha head at some shop, and it was quite heavy. I wanted to store it at my friend's apartment in Seoul. And he said, impossible. He said, my wife would not tolerate this in our apartment, that, she was an evangelical Christian, and she wouldn't even allow this, through the door. So that's indirect evidence.
There you go.
Jim, could I say a word about the book?
Yes. Okay. I think that's allowed.
Yeah. Well, the big danger of social science. And again, I'm an outsider. I'm not a social scientist and certainly not an economist. But the danger of social science.
I don't believe that you're not a social scientist.
No,
I can't
no,
accept
no,
that.
no
It's
degrees.
quite clear that.
The big danger is reductionism. It's taking a purely external point of view of social phenomena and trying then to explain them as if you're a natural scientist trying to explain the movement, the physics of billiard balls moving across a table when struck by the billiard crew. And you know, social scientists fall into this all the time. Maybe it's the prestige of the natural sciences because they've been so successful in our time. And to be real scientists, we social scientists, if I am one, need to think of ourselves as natural scientists. But a great virtue of this book is that it does not do that. It adopts what the late legal theorist H.L.A. Hart called the internal point of view. It's trying to understand a social phenomenon, here religion, the way it is understood by the people whose beliefs and practices constitute the social phenomenon under study. And that is just so much more illuminating. This is not to say, as Hart pointed out, this is not to say that only Buddhists can understand Buddhism from social scientific point of view, or only Christians can understand Christian practice or whatever. But it does mean that if you're not a member of the faith, you've got to be able to put yourself, think your way into the head of someone in the faith and understand why the person's doing it from the point of view of the person, rather than imposing some external explanation for the behavior on it. It's a real virtue of the book. So, you know, quite apart from the actual value of the book as a contribution to our understanding of the economics of religion, there's a big contribution here about how you do social science. It's a practical application of that insight that you've got to adopt an internal point of view. Don't explain away phenomenon. Explain social phenomenon by understanding them the way they're understood from the inside.
Hermeneutics.
Yeah, hermeneutics.
Take a hermeneutic view, yeah.
Well, one way of doing that, and indeed the book does that, is when we were thinking about Protestantism and Weber and thinking about how people viewed saving and working as a way of sort of affirming that they had indeed been sort of selected for the afterlife. I mean, there's another view, and I'm really interested in the Industrial Revolution, that the way Protestantism and the Reformation affected the Industrial Revolution wasn't that there were suddenly more people sort of trying to, you know, make sure it confirmed their place in the universe, but that they embraced science and experimentation as a way of sort of understanding a God who had decided their fate, but they could never truly, it's inscrutable, you could never truly understand God. And one way is by trying to discover his natural laws as a way of getting closer to God, and therefore you had sort of this flourishing of science and technology, even if it was just tinkering, that really sort of broke the world out of that Malthusian trap, and we had the Industrial Revolution. Any thought about that? I think Robert Merton, the sociologist, wrote about this.
Mm-hmm.
Wasn't that
Does that make any sense to you?
I mean, wasn't that Newton's motivation?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think
right.
that has a lot to do with it, is that the motive, I mean, you can hear it in Einstein, you can hear it in a lot of, you know, scientists that they believe there's something out there and it motivates them to further find the order, the rationality in it. But I think it really, sometimes it's really hard for us to, because we accept it's just here, is the idea that in Protestantism, it really was the feeling that this is the only way you're going to get salvation, is if you work really hard and use all your talents and use what God has given you to the best of your abilities. And I think that had a very profound effect. It didn't limit the use of innovation or scientific discovery. It didn't have the limitations in that sense. So I think Catholicism was a different example because Protestantism is not a hierarchical religion. And it allowed for competing points of view. It allowed for schisms, a lot of schisms, and different people thinking differently theologically, having their own interpretations. So I think that kind of opened it up. It really freed a lot of intellectual activity.
I mean, in that way, does it sort of sync with the work of Deirdre McCloskey, who looks at the Reformation as a way of breaking down hierarchies, and therefore he had a much greater appreciation for sort of the middle class or business, commercial class in a way that hadn't really existed before.
I wonder if people have seen the movie. I believe it was called Infinity. It's a movie based on a true story of a young Indian man from India, a Hindu man, who was a mathematics prodigy. His work came to the attention of Bertrand Russell at Cambridge, who was not only an unbeliever, but quite an evangelical unbeliever, an evangelical atheist. And the young Indian man ends up being brought to Cambridge under Russell's patronage, where Russell continues to marvel at what he is able to accomplish and what he sees. But the big divide between the two was over religion. What they could not understand about each other was the Indian man could not understand Bertrand Russell's atheism, and Russell couldn't understand the Indian man's faith. And it mattered because the Indian man saw what he was doing in mathematics as understanding an order of intelligibility that is there because God sponsors it, God puts it there, God sustains it, God created it. And you're understanding God's work there. Not comprehensively, not completely, but you're entering into a kind of cooperation with God in understanding what he's about. And this is just completely alien. Russell's not disrespectful. He doesn't insult the man or ridicule him or anything like that. But he's just utterly puzzled by it. And there's this chasm between the two, and they can't bridge it.
In terms of the Reformation, I think it's quite convincing that there's a special role of Protestantism, consistent with Weber's analysis, in terms of thinking where did the Industrial Revolution occur first in parts of Europe. What was the role of work ethic? What was the role of incentive to have more education, part of which had to do with literacy related to reading of the Bible? And I think there's also convincing evidence that some of that is maintained as a force even in more recent data, work showing something about Protestantism versus Catholicism in relation not only to schooling but also to work ethic. There's a very interesting recent paper that has been able to collect all the data from the German government about individuals serving in the German army during World War II. And he knows who's Protestant and who's Catholic, and he knows about all their background, and then he knows about their performance during the war, and he knows who got killed and who didn't, and who got injured. He knows who got medals and such. It's a very convincing analysis that there was something special about Protestantism in terms of productivity related to the military participation in Germany. I find this a very fascinating paper. It's one that's just been written recently.
I think in just like a couple minutes, we're going to open up for questions. So now would be a great time to think about those questions, those very brief, to the point questions that aren't perhaps a manifesto or anything. Just a very brief question. But I just want to, before we go to that, I just want to ask. China, I think China came up briefly. A country which has a growing number of Christians. Not able to practice their faith completely openly. What would you expect to be the impact, sort of vice versa, both of the growing Christian faith in China on their economy, or in a country which the faith is not entirely legal, on the growth of that faith in the coming decades?
Well, Ian Johnson, this journalist, has written a very good book on religion in China, and I think it came out last year. Again, it's very impressive how these underground churches, and in terms of Protestantism, but also in all other forms of religion in China, have been growing. Buddhism, Taoism, and now the Catholic Church has entered into an agreement with the Chinese government to reintroduce the hierarchy into China, with the bishops, ordaining the bishops in China. I think it's going to have an amazing effect if the government could back off from so severely regulating it. But I think that because the government made the decision that it didn't want any religions that had external ties, and Christianity is that religion, particularly Protestantism, so it clamps down fairly hard on forms of Protestantism while it allows what it calls native religions to flourish. But I think if it backed off, it would find a very vibrant market. And I think that it would help the exchange of ideas. It would help a lot of creativity in China if they would open up the religion market.
Yeah, for a while, it looked like in China that they were liberalizing, particularly in the sense of what they allowed in religion, and liberalizing in other dimensions also in terms of more opening up to market economy. But then more recently, they seem to have reversed that kind of process. And I certainly think the opening up of religion market would be one of the components that would contribute to maintaining economic growth in China, and that they should be doing it. You know, there's a lot of controversy about what the growth rate really is in China. Some people, I think, know a lot, think that the growth rate is actually close to zero rather than the numbers they report, which they tend to make up the numbers, actually. But I think the religiosity could be an important part of a vibrant setting in China, but that's also true with regard to other dimensions of legal system, market regulation, and so on. I think they're sort of going in the wrong direction now, actually.
There are obvious advantages to a flourishing religion market, but from the point of view of China's rulers, religion is a very dangerous thing. I was serving a few years ago as chairman of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, and we looked at China very, very closely and tried to figure out why there was so much religious repression. And across the board, you know, Tibetan and other Buddhists, house church Protestants, the Catholic Church, of course, was prior to the agreement that Rachel mentioned a moment ago. Any faith, and even Falun Gong, which didn't quite strike me as a religion. But it was a civil society institution. It had that in common with religion, and that's the key. I think what the Chinese leadership is fearful of is the way that institutions of civil society, like religions, become alternative authority structures and places where dissent can be incubated and can rally. I think they learned all too well the lessons of the fall of the Soviet Union. You know, when John Paul II made his historic trips to Poland early in his pontificate, I think the way the Chinese leaders look at it, and they're not wrong, I think, the way they look at it is that was the beginning of the end for Soviet communism. By allowing the Catholic Church to exist in Poland as an alternative authority structure, as a place where people could rally, where solidarity could find its kind of protector, they opened themselves up, the Soviets opened themselves up to the fall of Poland and then Eastern Europe and then communism in the Soviet Union itself. And my sense from my service on the commission is that the Chinese leadership is bound and determined that they're not going to let that happen in China. So religion is going to be kept on an extremely tight leash, and it's going to be persecuted and in some ways not tolerated at all.
All right, they've certainly studied the example of the Soviet Union closely. So we're going to go to questions. And this gentleman directly in front of me, if we could maybe get that mic. Let's wait for the microphone where it's coming. We're hurdling chairs, going across tables. And now we have that microphone.
Are open markets a corrupting or sanctifying force? It kind of flips your subject upside down. Meaning, you make a case, I believe, that religion adds to wealth. Now, my question is, does wealth add to religious belief? Or are open market competitive economies corrupting? Are they going to get us to hell or to heaven?
You know, open markets, as I interpret your expression, I think contributes to economic growth. And therefore, over time, society is richer in various dimensions. And with respect to religiosity, that gets back to the question of how economic progress feeds back into religion.
My question is whether they go to hell or heaven. Whether they go to church.
Well, we're not God.
The open market's corrupting. I mean, you get.
So
I don't want to
yeah.
talk. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm only
No, I
supposed to
Is this,
question.
is this a prosperity gospel question?
Well, you've got half of the electorate in the country saying, well, markets are bad, they're evil, and the other half is that these are great things, they're good, they lead you in the upper life, and the other ones, they're hell and heaven. It's a simple question, but no answer.
You know, prosperity can be dangerous, and an individual, I mean, ask any English aristocrat about his ne'er-do-well son who's been ruined by the fact that he's entitled and he never had to work and doesn't have to worry about his economic future. There are going to be dangers to wealth. I mean, part of why Jesus has his teaching on the subject, no doubt. But of course, it doesn't mean that if you're rich, you're going to be bad, or you're going to lose your faith, or you're going to lose your morality.
How about right back there's a...
Hello, thank you all very much. My name is Samuel with the Religious Freedom Institute. I spent 3 months working with the Jewish Christian Institute based in northern Galilee, so I spent a lot of time in Israel. My question is this. You've spoken both of otherworldly motivators, especially the terror of hell, as motivating the so-called Protestant work ethic. You've also asked the question inquiring whether states have become bastions of active entrepreneurship without fully functioning judiciary branches. What are your thoughts on the state of Israel as developed since 1948? Which is colloquially known today as the startup nation, composed of a majority of Jewish body, secular, none, and religious, as we talked about. But where fear of hell is non-existent in the most of Jewish thought, so there's not that external motivator. But there is a large fear of just humanity at large because of their long history of persecution. And they had a fully functioning entrepreneurial body long before they had a functioning judiciary. So what are your thoughts on just the nation state of Israel?
You know, when Israel was founded, and for a long time, it was very socialistic, which I thought at the time was obviously unfortunate and was retarding economic development in Israel for a long time. And then subsequently, it shifted dramatically away from that socialistic structure and much more toward the market. And because of that, I think Israel is basically a developed country now, which wouldn't have been true if you'd looked back 30 years or so. My colleague remarks about Judaism having lost the afterlife, somehow that was a negative and wasn't providing the motivations that it might have, as you were mentioning about not having this belief in hell. So I'm not sure how to isolate that as something that affects particularly economic activity in Israel in terms of, can I look at that one thing? And I don't know that it's particularly changed in certain points in time. I think it was there much longer than that. I've thought about this question in general. How much does it kind of hurt Judaism if it doesn't have certain of these beliefs that we thought were important in some other broader context? And I don't know that I have the answer to that. It's similar to questions in China about how much does it hurt that they don't have the kind of standard religious motivators for things like hard work and investment. And again, it's a question of what kind of substitutes for that.
And Orthodox Jews do believe in an afterlife on the whole, do believe in an afterlife. It's not as well worked out as the Christian account of it, but the belief is there. And it could be, again, because of demographics, that the future of the Jewish community is with the devout.
And two points on that. They are viewed as the chosen people, and they refer to themselves as the chosen people. So I think that could substitute, in a way, for a divine designation, in a sense. And the other thing that's interesting is when you look at surveys, when you look at quantitative data on Jews, they, as a religious group, have the highest level of educational attainment of all religious groups. So they tend to be rather cohesive. When you put all of these indicators together, you can kind of explain why they are where they're at.
Lady directly, as I'm rudely pointing at here.
This is regarding the study of canonization and beatification. Isn't it entirely possible that there have been so many canonizations and beatifications in recent years due to communications infrastructure, medical science, and other technology? And also, in terms of the media people becoming more aware of violations of human rights, of martyrdom and such.
I'm not sure I'm getting all of that, but I think there was a sharp break at the end of the 1970s into the 1980s in terms of the number of people being named. I wouldn't have identified that particularly with technological developments related to medical investigation or anything like that. I think it was something about John Paul II changing his attitude about the frequency of naming people in terms of these, particularly beatifications. It's a very extreme break. It's a complete outlier from things just before that. In fact, whether it's having a diminishing effect, which maybe your question suggested, that's something we're trying to look at in this current work. We're trying to look at what is the actual impact of naming somebody. Does it actually make people more enthusiastic and less likely to convert? I think we're trying to examine that.
I think you're onto some important things there. Part of the explanation has to do with theological developments in the period feeding into and then the Second Vatican Council and then the post-Second Vatican Council period. And John Paul's very much with the spirit of the Second Vatican Council on these things. And especially here what's relevant is the idea that sanctity is not something that is only exhibited or somehow reserved to people living monastic lives or clergy. Part of what the Second Vatican Council is all about is trying to overcome the problem of clericalism. You can't understand the modern pontificates post-Vatican II without seeing them as part trying to fulfill that promise of pushing back against clericalism. So the idea that John Paul's here interested in pushing, growing out of the Second Vatican Council, is the idea that all of us are capable of sanctity. Saints are not kind of these special people apart who've lived these lives that are completely different from the lives of ordinary men and women. No, we can all aspire to and achieve with work, with effort, with faith, through grace, sanctity in our own lives. And so you need role models for that. And you need to show that it's not just, a one in a million thing. That there can be lots of people and that you can achieve sanctity with very different lives in very different ways. The lives of saints aren't all cookie cutter, the same life. They're very, very different. They're all holy, right? They all overcome sin and resist temptation and recover from it when they've fallen and so forth. But the lives of saints can look very, very different. And I think that's part of what's going on, the modeling. And I think it is consistent with what Robert and Rachel are saying in the book about the role that beatifications and canonizations are playing in the church trying to hold up its side in the marketplace. It's saying to people, here's what Catholicism is about. There's a life that's lived the way Catholics should live their lives. Whatever you may think, whatever image you may have in your head of what the church understands itself to be and what it demands of people and so forth, here we want to hold up this model. This is what you are buying into when you buy into staying in the Catholic Church or coming into the Catholic Church or whatever.
So does this fit with this apparently special role of martyrdom that Francis has been pushing?
Yeah, I think this has a lot to do with the fact that the 20th century was the century of martyrs.
Yeah.
More martyrs, more Christian martyrs than ever before in the history of the church. And Francis in particular, this is also true of Benedict and John Paul II. They're concerned to make sure that that is not unmarked, unrecognized, that kind of Christian heroism, that kind of total giving to God is something that the church recognizes, holds up.
And to add that, those who are now being beatified are married.
Yes.
They're lay people, they're indigenous people. So they're embedded in contexts in which the Catholic Church can now become relevant in a way that it hasn't been so successful in other parts, or be enliven that relevance in a way that was lost.
Now here I think it's important, because I think what you're saying is true, but we've also, again, here have to look at it from the internal point of view. So that theology matters here. Without that theology, without that idea that we need to have, for the sake of the truth, a more capacious idea of sanctity. That idea, you take that out of the picture, you don't get the social phenomena that we have today.
All right, I have one more question, this gentleman directly, and then we're going to have to end it.
Well, first of all, thank you for your presentations and your very large body of work on growth and the puzzle that it is. My question, I would like to shift, as I understand your effort, to use economic concepts to understand how religion and growth connect. I would like to see if I can make more parallel economic concepts and religious concepts. 4 quick ones and then one question. So economists talk
Probably should just
about
get to the question.
labor, jobs,
Question possible.
employment versus vocation on the religious side. Ownership, economizing as economics, on the religious side, stewardship. Contract, rule of law on the economic side, covenant on the religious side. My question is not on religion, but in terms of scholars and teachers. Is a scholar more productive if he doesn't see him or herself as having a vocation as opposed to having a job and fulfilling an employment contract? And is not a teacher better if they have a sense of stewardship rather than just a sense of obligation? So it's not religious, but the religious concept results in greater productivity. So that put a question mark on that.
It's hard to
But-
separate the two, I think.
Yeah, but I
right?
think that's what
Yeah.
Max Weber was arguing.
Yeah.
Was he was arguing that the underpinnings, the religious underpinnings, have fallen away, and you know, for example, like if you read Calvin, he's very direct and very lively, and very right on the economics. He'll say that, yes, go out and make all the money. Go out, that's a sign that that it's a testimony of divine action in your behavior. So yeah, and be happy that you have the money. Accept it. He's not preaching asceticism at all. Okay, so the motivation is different. The motivation for him would be God's grace. You're working towards that. Okay, so what happens is that concept's there. You should work hard. You should do that. But the motivation changes. So we do have a vocation. We do have a calling. But the motivation is different, and it's hard to change that. What replaces it is some secular value, some secular driving force.
I mean, for me, the most obvious is the difference between contract and covenant. I mean, you sort of equate it too, but a contract without the sense of covenant needs to then be enforced by a whole set of, by a set of institutions that is costly. Whereas if you have a contract that is based on a covenant, it's a very different kind of an exchange, probably much more efficient. So in that sense, I would argue, certainly you see, from an efficiency standpoint, better economic growth.
Excellent. I'd like to thank our panel for coming, and as Calvin said, go out and make all the money.
Give some to AEF.
Not a direct quote. Not a direct quote.
I understand your point. It's it's interesting.
About antitrust.
Well, Geneva was very much involved in international trade.
Right.
And he was very much interested in promoting trade.
Was he worried about companies becoming too large?
Yes, he was.